أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، وصلى الله على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. Assalamu alaikum, dear brothers and sisters, wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And I'd like to welcome you all to lesson 2 of the commentary on Sharai Al-Islam fi Masail Al-Halali Wal-Haram by the famous Al-Muhaqiq Al-Hilli rahmatullahi alayh. As I mentioned, my dear brothers and sisters, it is no exaggeration to say that one of the most, if not the most illustrious jurist in the Shi'i tradition is Al-Muhaqiq Al-Hilli, who died in 676 after the Hijrah. He wrote many books, but his magnum opus is Sharai Al-Islam fi Masail Al-Halali Wal-Haram. This book contains over 12,000 ahkam, over 12,000 rulings. And because of the precision and the scholarly nature of this work, this text has been taught in the Islamic seminaries for more than 750 years. Those who joined the Hawza, for example, when they finished some of their preliminary courses, when they want to really embark on the study of Islamic jurisprudence, they typically select this textbook. Now, this book has captured the attention of many great ulama over several centuries, from the beginning of its authorship until today. In fact, over 100 commentaries have been written on Sharai al-Islam. But perhaps the best commentary that was ever written on this book was written by the great Shaheed al-Thani, who died in 966 after the Hijrah. And he wrote مسالك الأفهام إلى شرح شرائع الإسلام. His commentary spanned 15 volumes. And his commentary, Shaheed al-Thani's commentary on the ibadat, on acts of worship, his commentary was quite brief regarding ibadat. He focused most of his attention on mu'amalat, on transactions, and hence 13 out of the 15 volumes within this book is actually dedicated to mu'amalat. So he's much more comprehensive and exhaustive when it comes to the commentary on the mu'amalat section. Now, Shaheed al-Thani, he had a grandson by the name of Sayyid Muhammad al-Amili. He also wrote, like his grandfather, he wrote a commentary on Shara'i'. And his commentary was known as Madarik al-Ahkam fi Sharh Shara'i' al-Islam. Now, Sahib al-Madarik, he saw that his grandfather had written a commentary on Shara'i' which focused primarily on the mu'amalat. So what he did was he wrote a commentary that focused primarily on the ibadat, and his commentary is available, and it's made up of 8 volumes. Now, these two commentaries, if someone wants to truly understand Shara'i' in a deep way and uncover some of its subtleties, these two references, I think, suffice. In fact, most of the teachers in the Hawza, when they prepare their lessons on the commentary of Shara'i', they use Masalik al-Afham and Madarik, because both of them, they offer depth on certain areas of Shara'i'. In fact, even the great Sahib al-Jawahir, in his 43 volumes on Islamic jurisprudence, so a lot of his material is actually taken from the books of Masalik and Madarik. Now, it's important for us to keep in mind that as we go through this text, I'm not giving you legal rulings for you to apply, right? You have to refer to your own marja. The purpose of this book is to familiarize ourselves with the language of medieval jurists and to appreciate the way that they categorize the discussions of fiqh, and to also expose ourselves to a small degree of juristic reasoning. So I would say about 25% of Sharai can be dedicated to istidlali discussions. And then inshallah, as we progress, and if Allah gives us the tawfiq to have some discussions on lum'ah, you'll see that about 50% of lum'ah, if the teacher is skilled, they can introduce the student to about 50% istidlal, legal reasoning in their discussions. Now, Sharai al-Islam is basically the legal manual of the opinions of Muhaqiq Al-Hilli. It's essentially the Risala Amaliya of Al-Muhaqiq Al-Hilli. And this is important to note. You know, some of us might think that the concept of a Risala Amaliya is something that is new, right? This book is actually written for non-specialists. In fact, when we read the last paragraph of the introduction, we will see that the reason why Al-Muhaqiq Al-Hilli wrote Sharai is to basically present the legal rulings to the laity, right? So the writing of legal manuals for non-specialists is not a new practice, my dear brothers and sisters. We shouldn't think that this is something that began, a few decades ago. Sharai al-Islam is basically the Risala Amali of Muhaqiq Al-Hilli. In fact, Man La Yahdharuhu Al-Faqih by Sheikh Al-Saduq is basically the Risala Amaliya of Sheikh Al-Saduq, but instead of putting the legal rulings in his words, he presents the ahadith. The ahadith themselves are that he believes are authentic or are a hujjah. He presents them as his legal rulings. If you look at Sheikh Al-Tusi, his book An-Nihaya is basically a Risala Amaliya of his legal opinions. So what we want to do now is that we want to look at the introduction of the book, because it's always important for us to read the introduction of a book that we want to study, to understand the intent of the scholar, what the scholar wants us to walk away with. So if we go to the introduction, of course, the beginning, he basically sends salutations upon the Prophet and his family. He begins with the glorification of Allah and so on and so forth. And then he says, وَبَعْد. He says, وَبَعْدُ فَإِنَّ رِعَايَةَ الْإِيمَانِ توجب قضاء حق الإخوان والرغبة في الثواب تبعث على مقابلة السؤال بالجواب. He says, فإن رعاية الإيمان, right? Faith dictates that a person should respond to the needs of their brethren, right? وبعد فإن رعاية الإيمان توجب قضاء حق الإخوان والرغبة في الثواب تبعث على مقابلة السؤال بالجواب. And the desire for reward from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala motivates a person to answer the religious questions that are put to him. So here he's explaining his motivation for writing this book. And then he says, وَمِنَ الْأَصْحَابِ مَنْ عَرِفْتُ الْإِيمَانَ مِنْ شَأْنِهِ وَاسْتَنَبْتُ الصَّلَاحَ عَلَى صَفَحَاتِ وَجْهِهِ وَنَفَحَاتِ لِسَانِهِ. He mentions that there are some people, among his companions. Muhaqiq Al-Hilli says, there are some from among my friends and companions whom I have recognized the sign of faith in them. I have recognized the sign of faith regarding the way that they conduct themselves with their affairs. وَاسْتَنَبْتُ الصَّلَاحَ عَلَى صَفَحَاتِ وَجْهِهِ. And I could detect righteousness on their face, right? On the pages of their face, as he says. and through the nafahat from their lisan, through the words that they utter. سألني أن أملي عليه مختصرا في الأحكام. This person, this friend, this companion of Muhaqiq Al-Hilli had asked him to dictate, to write down a summary of the Islamic rulings that relate to the life of the believer. A summary of all of the ahkam that we need in our daily lives. متضمنا لرؤوس مسائل الحلال والحرام. A book to write down some ahkam that cover the main topics that relate to halal and haram. يكون كالمفتي الذي يصدر عنه أو الكنز الذي ينفق منه. He says that this book, that this person had asked me to compile a book that covers the main rulings relating to halal and haram, what is forbidden and what is obligatory, and that this book will act as a mufti. It will act as a religious scholar who will give a verdict, right? So if you have a question about a particular issue, you will go to my book, and my book will basically be a source of fatwas for you. It will be like a silent mufti. You open it and you receive the answers that you're looking for, or a treasure that you can take from, right? And then he says, فَابْتَدَأْتُ مُسْتَعِينًا بِاللَّهِ. He says, so I began this initiative, I began this project of compiling a book for laypersons that would act as a mufti for them, that would be a source, a reference point for them to understand their duties before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to understand what He has prohibited them from and what He has obligated them to do. So I begin by seeking help from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَمُتَوَكِّلًا عَلَيْهِ. And I begin by placing my trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. فَلَيْسَ الْقُوَّةُ إِلَّا بِهِ. Because there is no power without Allah. وَلَا الْمَرْجِعُ إِلَّا إِلَيْهِ. And there is no refuge except with Him. وَهُوَ مَبْنِيٌّ عَلَىٰ أَقْسَامٍ أَرْبَعَةٍ. He says that my book is divided into 4 chapters, 4 main chapters. القسم الأول في العبادات. The first section is related to ibadat, acts of worship. Now, what is the meaning of ibadat? Because if you look at the way that he has organized his book, Shaheed Thani basically divided his book into 4 sections. The first is ibadat, acts of worship. And I'll speak a little bit about what is the meaning of ibadat. So section 1 is on ibadat. Section 2 is on uqud, contracts. Section 3 is on iqa'at, unilateral proceedings. And again, I'll explain what that means. And the fourth section deals with ahkam, which we can call miscellaneous rulings. Now, when it comes to ibadat, my dear brothers and sisters, ibadat refer to acts that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has commanded us to do that must be coupled with the intention of seeking nearness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So these are actions, but performing the action, these are certain things that we have to do. They are those acts that must be done with a specific niyyah, meaning that if you perform these actions without the proper intention, which is qurbatan ila Allah ta'ala, which is to seek the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the act is void. So with ibadat, it's not just about performing the action. It's about performing the right action with the right intention. Otherwise, the action is invalid. An example of ibadat is wudu. Ablution is an act of worship. It's not sufficient to just perform the act of washing the face, washing the hands, arms, and wiping the head and wiping the feet. That's not sufficient. If someone is doing that, performing all of those actions meticulously, but they're doing it with the intention of just cooling down because it's a hot summer day, that wudu is batil. Because wudu is an act of worship. Wudu must be performed with the intention of qurba, with the intention of seeking nearness to Allah. Salah is the same. Zakat, khums, jihad. If someone fights in the battlefields and they're fighting just to acquire spoils of war, they're not doing it qurbatan ilallah. This is not called jihad. This is not, because jihad is a type of ibadah. It's not enough for you to just pay khums. Let's say you pay your khums, but you're paying it because you want to show off, or you want the wakil of the marji' to see you so he can do favors for you later on. No. That charity, that khums, that zakat becomes invalid. It doesn't count because it has to be done with the niyyah of qurba. And then we have uqud. Uqud are basically contracts. An example of an aqd is a rental contract. When you hire someone, it has an aqd is a contract between two or more parties. There needs to be an initiator and there needs to be an acceptance, right? There needs to be ijab and qabul, right? You have someone who's renting, and then you have a tenant, right? Someone who's initiating the contract and then someone who's accepting the terms of that contract. Marriage, for example, is an aqd. It's a contract. The woman says, "Zawajtuka nafsi," "ala al-mahr al-ma'lum." I marry myself to you with the specified bridal gift, and the man says, "qabilt." There's an initiator and there's an acceptor. Ijab and qabul. There are two or more parties involved, and the consent of all of them is required. So these are uqud, and inshallah, if Allah gives us the tawfiq, we'll try to cover some of these. So uqud would an example of an aqd would be kitabul nikah, kitabul tijara, right, commerce, right, kitabul ijara. So all of those transactions that are contract based, that require an initiator and an acceptor, where there are two or more parties that have to consent to the terms of agreement, this is known as an aqd, and the plural is uqud. And then you have iqa'at. Iqa'at, so an aqd literally means a knot. If we want to look at its literal meaning, it's a knot. Now there are some of these uqud, they can be undone through the desire of one person. The contract can be dissolved or it can be undone through the actions of one party. So an example of an iqa' is divorce. In Islamic law, by default, the husband has the power to divorce. And of course, people always ask this question, what if he gives this? He cannot give this right to his wife. The right to divorce is with the husband. All he can do, if he would like to do so, is that he authorizes his wife, and this can be stipulated in the marriage contract, he can authorize his wife to act as his representative to conduct the divorce. But it's the husband who has the right to divorce. Now, if a husband wants to divorce his wife, and again, this is not something that we recommend, but we're just looking at the law. The law of God, according to the Ahlul Bayt, says that if a husband wants to divorce his wife, her consent is not required. Her consent is not required. The divorce takes place if he initiates it. It's a unilateral proceeding. Iqa'at. It doesn't require her to consent or accept the divorce. Another example is, if someone wants to give an endowment to the masjid, you have a copy of the Quran and you want to designate it as waqf. You could say, أوقفت هذا القرآن هذا المصحف إلى المسجد. I endow this copy of the Quran to the masjid. There doesn't need to be a person who represents the masjid to say, قبلت, I accept your endowment. It's not. So these are all known as iqa'at. unilateral proceedings. They only require one party for this action to take effect. And then we have ahkam. Ahkam are basically any rulings that don't fall under the category of ibadat. They're not acts of worship that require the intention of seeking nearness to Allah, nor are they contracts that have two parties that need to consent and agree to the terms, nor is it a unilateral proceeding. They don't apply to any of these. So we can say that they are miscellaneous rulings. An example is the laws of criminal laws in Islam, the penal code in the Islamic tradition. You look at the distribution inheritance law. There are a lot of rulings that don't relate. You know, the conditions for an Islamic judge, for example, Kitab al-Qadha. The rulings that relate to a vow, you know, nadhr or yameen or an ahd, and so on and so forth. So to summarize, the book Sharai Al-Islam is divided into 4 sections. The first is the section on ibadat, acts of worship, those actions that require the intention of seeking nearness to Allah for them to be valid. Number 2, the second section, Kitab al-Uqud, al-Qism al-Thani, al-Uqud, contracts. And these are basically rulings that relate to contracts, where you have 2 or more parties involved, and there's an initiation of the contract and there's an acceptance of the contract. Both parties need to agree to the terms of the contract. And then you have iqa'at, you have unilateral proceedings, like the example of divorce that we gave, where one party has the authority to initiate the action, and it takes effect by the initiation of one party, one individual, for it to take effect. There is no need for the consent of a second party. And we gave the example of talaq and awqaf. And then the fourth is the miscellaneous sections. وهي 10 كتب نبدأ بالأهم منها فالأهم. Now, when it comes to section 1, which is on ibadat, and ibadat is the plural of ibadah. Ibadah, an act of worship. Ibadat, acts of worship. The first section is on acts of worship, and there are 10 sections. There are 10 subsections within ibadat. And he says, نبدأ بالأهم منها فالأهم. He says we're going to begin by discussing the most important. And then we will move on to those that are a little bit less important. So there's a logic to the order of the topics that Al-Muhaqiq Al-Hilli will cover. So the first section that we see is Kitab al-Tahara. Now, Muhaqiq Al-Hilli is saying that the order that I'm going to follow is a reflection of what is most important, and then what is second most important. The first chapter is, the first chapter is Kitab al-Tahara, purification, which is basically wudu, tayammum, and ghusl. Muhaqiq Al-Hilli is saying that this is the most important. Now one may ask, Tahara is more important than Salah? Purification is more important than prayer? I thought prayer is Amududdin. I thought prayer is the most important act of worship within Islam. The answer is, according to the teachings of Ahlul Bayt, La salata illa bi tahur. There is no valid prayer without purification. So tahara is more important than salah from the perspective that without understanding the rulings of tahara, your prayer is not valid. So it is more important than the prayer from the perspective that tahara is a prerequisite to salah. If there's a problem with tahara, if you cannot achieve ritual purity or purity from hadath and khabath, and we'll speak about what this means, then you're not able to pray. So the first section is Kitab al-Tahara. The first kitab, the first book, which is basically a section or a chapter, is Tahara. And then the second is Salah. And then the third is Siyam, fasting. Now, you may say, so we know that Tahara is a prerequisite for Salah. And that's why it's mentioned before. La salata illa bi tahur. Of course, prayer is after Tahara, prayer is mentioned. Not fasting, not Hajj, not anything else. Because we have a hadith from the Prophet ﷺ where he says, As-salatu amududdin. Prayer is the pillar of religion. You know, think of a pillar, think of a tent that has a pole in the middle. If you remove the pole, the entire tent collapses. Similar to this is prayer, salah. If someone does not pray, there is nothing that is holding up their faith, their relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the hadith says, in qubilat qubila ma siwaha. If your prayer is maqbool, if it's accepted, everything else is accepted. Wa in ruddat rudda ma siwaha. And if it's rejected, everything else is rejected. Now, many people, they misunderstand this hadith and they think that if I pray, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will accept all of my other deeds, even if they're not done properly, or that's not what the hadith is saying. The hadith, because the hadith says what? As-salatu amududdin in qubilat qubila ma siwaha. Prayer is the pillar of religion. If your prayer is accepted, now question, whose prayer is accepted? Whose prayer is maqbool? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In the Quran, He mentions to us there is only one group of people whose prayer is accepted, i.e., it is done in a way that is truly pleasing to Allah. And that is the muttaqeen. إِنَّمَا يَتَقَبَّلُ اللَّهُ مِنَ الْمُتَّقِينَ. So if Allah accepts your prayer, that means you're a pious person, you're a muttaqi. And a person of taqwa is going to fulfill all of the other obligations, other than salah, not just salah, the prayer and all of those other obligations. But salah is mentioned in this hadith specifically to emphasize its importance. If your fasting is maqbool, that means you're a muttaqi. And a person of taqwa is going to fulfill all of their obligations. So this hadith mentions salah, it singles out prayer to highlight the unique importance of salah and the spiritual development of the human being. Now, what is the meaning of tahara? The word tahara, linguistically, it basically means an-nadafa wan-nazaha. It basically means cleanliness or for something to be impeccable. It is said, linguists, they say nadafa refers to physical cleanliness, right? It refers to the cleanliness of maddiyat, of tangible things, physical cleanliness. So for example, one could say, هَذَا ثَوْبٌ طَاهِرٌ. This is a dress or an article of clothing that is tahir, meaning it's clean. Right? So nadafa, linguistically, usually refers to physical cleanliness, whereas nazaha refers to purity of character. For example, you can say, هَذَا رَجُلٌ طَاهِرٌ. This is a pure man, meaning he's a person of impeccable character. Right? Now, tahara, when we speak about tahara in fiqh, we're not talking about cleanliness in kind of the commonsensical meaning of cleanliness. We're speaking about a very specific technical definition of tahara. And perhaps the best definition that has ever been given on for tahara is by Al-Muhaqiq Al-Hilli. He says, الطهارة اسم للوضوء أو الغسل أو التيمم على وجه له تأثير في استباحة الصلاة. He says طهارة is the name, it's a noun that is used to describe wudu. So when someone does wudu, we say this is tahara, right? What the state that is achieved when a person performs wudu, we call this tahara. When a person does ghusl, the state that is achieved after one performs ghusl is tahara. When someone performs tayammum, because of absence of water or because water might harm them, the state that is created in a person is called tahara. But not every wudu, not every ghusl, not every tayammum is the tahara that we're speaking about. When we speak about tahara, what we're talking about على وجه له تأثير في استباحة الصلاة. He says tahara is basically a noun. It's a reference to what wudu and what ghusl and what tayammum creates in us that makes it permissible for us to enter into prayer. Now, why does he define it this way? Because not every wudu can be used to pray. So for example, if someone is in a state of janaba, it's makruh to eat while you're in a state of janaba. Someone goes and performs wudu to lift the makruhiyya of eating. That wudu does not permit you to stand and enter into the state of prayer. So that's not a tahara. Ghusl. Not every ghusl is going to achieve tahara, the tahara that is going to allow you to pray. So for example, let's say that there is some ghusl that is mentioned in some of the narrations, but we don't have any authentic narrations that a particular ghusl is indeed mustahab. That ghusl is not going to achieve a tahara that will allow you to enter into a state of prayer. So not every wudu, not every ghusl, not every tayammum. For example, if someone is performing tayammum to teach someone how to do tayammum, right, that tayammum is not going to allow you. Let's say that you're doing tayammum to show someone how to do tayammum, but there's wudu available, there's water that's available. That tayammum is not going to achieve tahara, purification, that would permit you to enter in a state of prayer. So tahara refers to, it's a noun. So here we're not speaking about the mantiqi definition, because we can't give a mantiqi definition that, just like when we say, what is a human being? Al-insan hayawanun natiq, where you mention the genus and the differentia, the jins and the fasl. Here it's more of a linguistic, it's a lafzi, it's a ta'rif lafzi. So الطهارة اسم للوضوء أو الغسل أو التيمم على وجه له تأثير في استباحة الصلاة. Tahara is only that type of purification that is achieved through wudu or ghusl or tayammum that has an effect in terms of permitting us to enter in a state of prayer. Another example of a tayammum that does not allow us, does not achieve tahara for us to pray is, imagine someone, he goes to bed, and of course it's mustahab to go to bed in a state of tahara. If someone is in bed and they're too tired to get up and do wudu, what they can do is they can do tayammum on their blankets, because of a riwayah that says we can do so. But that tayammum on your blanket before you go to sleep, that does not put you in a state of tahara where you can get up after a few minutes and pray salatul layl. No. That tayammum does not achieve the tahara that allows you to pray. A woman is menstruating. She's in a state of hayd. It's the time of salah. She goes and does wudu, and she sits on her musalla and does tasbih. That wudu does not achieve tahara. That woman who's menstruating cannot enter into salah. So even though she's doing wudu, that wudu does not have an effect. It's only that wudu or that ghusl or that tayammum that has an effect in terms of making it permissible to stand for prayer. Now, before I continue, it's important for us to note that the word tahara and the word salah and the word psalm, these are words that existed in the Arabic language before the advent of Islam. That's why I began by mentioning the linguistic meaning of tahara. Because before the advent of Islam, tahara did not mean wudu, ghusl, and tayammum. It meant cleanliness, nadafa. It meant impeccability of a person's character, for example, nazaha. But later on, these words, they took on a new meaning, right? Either because the Prophet designated those terms, and these are known as manqulat shar'iyyah. These are words that have taken on a new religious meaning. And this change in meaning that happens, sometimes it's done by the Prophet. For example, imagine the Prophet says, the word salah, linguistically, it means dua. But whenever I use the word salah, I'm referring to these 5 daily prayers, for example. Or I'm referring to this formal worship that's comprised of bowing and prostrating. So this is known as haqiqa shar'iyyah, right? Now, if it's something that happens organically and it's not something that's formally announced by the Prophet, we call this haqiqa mutasharri'iyya, where organically, through repetitive usage, the word takes on a new meaning. So the word salah, linguistically, it means dua. The linguistic meaning of salah, it means dua. And in fact, even in the Quran, it's used sometimes to mean dua. For example, when you look at the ayah in the Quran, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this is in Surah At-Tawbah, where He commands the Prophet to take zakat from the Muslims. خُذْ مِنْ أَمْوَالِهِمْ صَدَقَةً تُطَهِرُهُمْ وَتُزَكِّيهِمْ بِهَا. Take from them. So this is a religious tax. The Prophet is told to take from their wealth the obligatory charity of zakat, so that it can purify them, it can cleanse them. And then Allah says what? وَصَلِّ عَلَيْهِمْ. Now what does it mean for the Prophet? صَلِّ عَلَيْهِمْ. It means make dua for them. إِنَّ صَلَاتَكَ سَكَنٌ لَهُمْ. When people have to give religious taxes in the form of zakat, it's very heavy on them. It's very difficult for people to part with their wealth. So to make it easier, so they're less anxious and upset about giving money in the way of Allah, Allah tells the Prophet, make dua for them when they come and give zakat. Make dua that Allah protects them, that Allah elevates them. Inna salataka sakanun lahum. Because your salah, O Prophet, is a means of tranquility for them. It brings peace to their hearts. What is the meaning of salah here? Basically, Allah is saying that your dua for them, Ya Rasulullah, it brings serenity to their hearts. It makes them less upset about giving zakat, right? So salah, it originally meant dua, but over time, it refers to this formal worship that we engage in. Tahara, the same thing. Tahara, before the advent of Islam, it meant cleanliness, nadafa, nazaha. With the advent of Islam and with the introduction of these practices, either through a prophetic announcement or through repetitive usage by the religious community, tahara basically is a reference to wudu, ghusl, or tayammum. The same thing with fasting. The word sawm existed before the advent of Islam, and it simply meant to abstain. This is why in Surah Maryam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions the linguistic meaning of siyam. إِنِّي نَذَرْتُ لِلرَّحْمَنِ صَوْمًا. Sayyida Maryam, she says, I have made a vow to Allah to abstain. Abstain from food, no, abstain from speech. Sawma means to abstain. It can mean to abstain from anything. But gradually over time, Sawm and Siyam, they refer to abstaining from certain things with the intention of seeking nearness to Allah. And this is what we do in the month of Ramadan. So he says, so again, We're beginning with Kitab al-Tahara because it's the most important. After Kitab al-Tahara, we speak about Kitab al-Salah. Without understanding the rules of Tahara, your prayer is not going to be valid. So there's a logic to the order of the topics here. So Tahara here, we're speaking about the technical religious definition of Tahara. It's ismun lil wudu. It's a name. It's a noun for wudu. Right? What is achieved when a person performs. When you finish your wudu, you're in a state of Tahara. When you do ghusl, you're in a state of Tahara. When you do tayammum, under certain conditions, you're in a state of Tahara. But we're speaking about the wudu and the ghusl and the tayammum على وجه له تأثير في استباحة الصلاة. The salah becomes mubah. It becomes permissible for you to enter into ritual prayer. وكل واحد منها. And we give examples of the types of wudu and ghusl and tayammum that would not put you in a state of tahara that would permit you to stand for prayer. وكل واحد منها ينقسم إلى واجب وندب. And each one of these can be divided into obligatory or recommended. Wajib means obligatory. وندب, this is an important word to know. It's a term. It basically means mustahab. Nadb means mustahab. So he's saying here, there are certain wudu, there's a certain wudu that's going to be wajib. There are certain ablutions, certain wudus that are going to be mustahab. Same thing is going to apply to ghusl. There are certain obligatory ghusls. There are recommended ghusl. There are obligatory instances where you have to do tayammum. And there are certain times where it is recommended to do tayammum. And inshallah, we will cover these details in our next session. فَالْوَاجِبُ مِنَ الْوُضُوءِ. As for the obligatory types of wudu, inshallah, we'll cover it in our next session. وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على محمد وآله الطاهرين.